Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is Pete from My Jewelry Bench, and today we're going to be talking about this Elgin 16 size 15 jewel pocket watch. This watch has a few issues, some of which we can see right off the bat. If you look closely, you'll see that the minute hand is a little bent out of shape, probably because it's missing the crystal. We're also missing a second hand, which is not a problem. I have a lot of those in stock, so we can fix that. We have a no sunk or a flat porcelain dial. And this again is a 15 jewel. You can tell it's a hunter case movement. It is in an upright case, but it is a hunter case movement. So let's open it up and take a look at what's inside. And here's the inside of the watch. It is a 15 jewel brass movement. Very common for this quality of watch. I didn't look up the serial number, so I don't know the date. I'm sure somebody can leave some comments in the comment section below if you know the date for this watch. I will go look it up later. This Elgin movement is in good shape, other than it's got a few problems. I found a couple cracked jewels on the balance, upper and lower, so we're going to replace those, the whole jewels. We've got a loose adjustment arm, so we're going to just tighten that up a little bit, and we're going to go ahead and do a restoration on this watch. Let's get started. Okay, so let's do the first things first. I need to grab a crystal and a second hand, so I grabbed those because those are the only parts that this watch is missing. And I'm going to pull off the hands now. If you look closely at the dial, you can see somebody ground down the dial to fit this particular case. This is not an original case for this particular movement, and unfortunately somebody kind of ground down the sides so that the case would screw onto, or the bezel would screw onto the frame of the case. Okay, so here we go. We're going to remove the movement. We're going to turn those half screws a little bit and just pop out the movement. And the next thing I'm going to do is just take a look at the movement. You can see it's pretty dirty. This watch probably hasn't been cleaned in about 50 or 60 years. So let's get in there and remove these dial screws or loosen them up so that we can get the dial off. And of course, on American pocket watches, there are typically 3 dial screws that hold the dial in place. Sometimes on smaller watches, you'll have just 2. Once we get that off, we can gently pry up the dial, and the dial should come right off the watch movement, which it does in this case. So you can see on the edges, the perimeter where somebody ground that down should be porcelain all the way around. Unfortunately, that little modification was made. It's not going to really affect the watch, and you're not going to see it once the bezel is on the watch. This dial washer is pretty shot, so we're going to put a new one on because it's not even doing anything with the dial anymore. Next thing I'll do is remove the hour wheel. Then we'll take the set wheel out, and then the cannon pinion. With this watch, I didn't need to use a cannon pinion puller. I just used my tweezers, and it came right off. For me, the next step is to remove the balance bridge, so we'll take the balance completely off the watch. That one screw we'll put in the parts tray, and then we will take the complete balance, gently lift it out, and put that aside in the parts tray. Next is the pallet bridge. So this little pallet bridge just has one screw, and we can remove that one screw, put that in the parts tray with the bridge, and we'll grab that pallet fork. There is a little wind left to this watch, and we're just going to let it wind down before we actually replace the mainspring and continue on with disassembly. So now it's a good time to remove the 2 case screws. Now these are half screws, so you would typically leave them in the watch when you're doing general maintenance. However, in a complete disassembly, we're going to take those right out. And we'll pull the barrel bridge off. 2 screws hold the barrel bridge. Lift that bridge out and put it along with the screws in the parts tray. And we'll take the stem out and put that aside. Let's get the barrel out, the ratchet wheel. And now we can work on the train bridge. Train bridge in this case holds 3 of the gears. So we'll pull these 2 screws out. Gently lift that up and put it in the parts tray. Then we can remove each of the train gears from the highest or the first gear all the way up to the escapement. You can see how they're staggered. This is also a good time to go ahead and examine them because you want to check for damage or dirt. see if there's any problems in here. These were pretty sticky. Just tells me that this watch hasn't been serviced in a long time. Next thing I'm going to do is tighten up those 3 dial screws. And we can move on to the face of the watch movement and remove the winding system. In this case, the lever and the complete clutch system here that allows you to wind and set the watch. This is a reverse thread screw, so you're going to gently turn that. Again, we're going to put these in our parts tray and keep them all organized. And we'll take the little system here out, the clutch system out completely. We have a cap and a bunch of gears there. We're just going to put those all in the parts tray. It's hard to see here, but we're going to remove the little bridge that holds one of the set gears. And then we'll just gently lift that up. Once that's up, we can pull it out and put it in the parts tray with the gears. And now we're looking at the lever system. So you can see the lever system is set with a bunch of springs that articulate the lever back and forth. So we're going to remove these 2 springs. One of the springs was put in wrong the last time it was assembled, so we're going to pull that out and make sure that when we put it back together, we put it in the right way. So we'll get that spring out. Now we'll get this little lock in place, and we'll move that. That little lock prevents the lever from being pulled completely out of the movement, so we're going to grab the lever now and pull that out. And then we'll grab that last set gear out and put that aside along in the parts tray. So here's this little spring, and you can see that articulates with the lever, and it pushes up a little stopper gear, and that allows us to, when we pull it out, it articulates back and forth, engaging or disengaging the clutch. And now I'm going to take a look at the lower and upper balance jewels, because we do have 1 cracked jewel in this watch. I thought there were 2. If you look closely, you can see that this jewel is cracked. I thought, again, there were 2 cracked jewels, but one just had an inclusion or a flaw in it. It wasn't cracked at all. Now here I'm removing the lower screws, the lower balance jewel screws, and these are actually stripped completely out. So when I reassemble this, I'll be using a little bit of Loctite to hold those in place. And this is how you go ahead and remove the balance jewels. So 2 little screws hold the upper and the cap jewel and the hole jewel tight in the movement. Because they're stripped, I had to use a small little screwdriver to push those out because they wouldn't come out all the way. Got the screws out, and then we can put those aside. I keep these in a separate parts tray so that I know all these little pieces and bits go together. Now let's remove the 2 jewels. Again, there's a hole jewel and a cap jewel here. So we pull those out, and they should separate pretty easily if they're not relatively too dirty. And again, this one, the hole jewel was cracked, I believe, on this particular piece. So we're going to actually go ahead and replace it. We're going to do the same with the balance bridge. The upper jewels here are really dirty. So we're going to unscrew the screw that holds the collet in place. And I'm going to go ahead and retighten that because I'm not going to remove it for cleaning. Now we'll go ahead and examine the balance. This balance is good. The balance staff is good. Everything is really in good shape there. We just need to clean it. And here you can see the jewel itself. Actually, I think this was the jewel that was cracked, the upper jewel. You can see on the hole jewel in the picture there, it is definitely cracked. We'll remove these 2 screws that hold the upper jewels in place. Again, we have a cap and a hole jewel. So just gently remove those. And we'll pop these out. And then we'll take a look at them under the microscope and see exactly what's wrong here. That's our hole jewel right there. And there's definitely a crack in that, and the cap jewel is got an inclusion in it. Now I've got a new mainspring. We're going to stick that in the barrel. I've already gone ahead and cleaned the barrel at this point. So I've got the new mainspring in position. We're just going to snap it in place. Once that's done, I can go ahead and give it a little bit of oil. Before I do that, I'm actually going to put the barrel arbor in place. The barrel arbor is the locking mechanism that actually helps wind the watch. Use some spring oil. And then we'll put the cap on. Once we're done with the cap, the barrel is ready to go back into the movement once we've got that ready for assembly. So I'm not going to bore you with the ultrasonic cleaning of all the parts, but I did go ahead and do that. So now we've got everything cleaned, dried off, rinsed, and we're ready to reassemble. So here I've got some replacement jewels that we're going to put in the balance bridge. First thing we want to do is just double check them and make sure everything's good. There's the cap jewel, and this is the hole jewel, the new hole jewel that I've got in there. We're going to put that in. I'm going to use a staking kit for that. Just tap it in. They go in very gently, and they're usually not very hard to put in. Now the cap jewel, typically on American pocket watches, will have two little detents, and that's where the screws will hold it down into place. So once we get that jewel in place, we can kind of twist it so that the screw heads will fit appropriately. Just make whatever adjustments you need to make. And then we can put the jewels back in, or the screws for the jewels back in place. These are very easy to strip, especially on a brass movement, so be very gentle with them. They should tighten up pretty good. Just use your judgment. You don't want to over-tighten them. Once the second one is set, we can go ahead with the next step of our balance and finish the assembly of our balance. To do that, I'm going to loosen that screw that holds the hairspring stud. And then we're going to gently place our balance back into the bridge. And here you can see this is where the end of the hairspring will attach just prior to the stud location. And that allows us to speed up and slow down the watch ever so gently. Once I've got the balance in position onto the bridge, we can go ahead and tighten up that screw that holds the stud firmly in place. Now let's move on to the frame of the watch, and we're going to go ahead and insert the lower hole jewel. Again, I replaced this jewel also. And then we have the cap jewel that goes in exactly the same as the upper jewel. We're just going to get that in the hole a little bit and then line it up so that the screw heads will hold it in place. Now sadly, this watch, a long time ago, this watch was pretty well abused, and when somebody was going ahead to service it, they did a number on the threads here. I didn't want to retap them or use larger screws because I could damage the frame. So I went ahead and just put a little Loctite in the holes, and that ended up holding the jewels firmly in place so that I have no slippage. Now in that case, when you have loose screws that hold these jewels in place, what happens is the jewels will loosen up a little bit and the watch will run very erratically. Now that's done, we'll just take a look at it, and it looks good. Let's get on to the rest of the assembly. We're going to start with the clutch system and winding system. Now here I'm going to start the process of assembling the lever. And again, we have to get the set gears in place. Now this is a spring gear, so that won't stay in position until we get the lever in the watch frame itself. And this slides in on a track. There is that stopper there that holds the lever from being pulled out of the watch movement once it's assembled correctly. So once we get that in position, I can kind of push that one gear down a little bit. Kind of hard to do with my thumb, but we're going to get that to work. And there you go. You can see how we've got it. We're just going to move that little stop lever out of the way so that we can get that to work properly and not allow the lever to be pulled out of the watch movement. Okay. Now we can go ahead and put that little plate back on that holds one of the set screws. There's just one little screw that holds that in position. Make sure it's keyed right on the threads and then tighten it down. Click. Okay, we'll go ahead and tighten up that one spring for the stopper. Now that stopper there again holds the, that little spring actually is what articulates the clutch system for winding and setting. This little spring here is actually what holds back the lever or the stopper for the lever from being pulled out and allows it to be clicked back. So when you gently push the lever back in, it'll snap into place. It's a little tricky to work with sometimes, but once you get the hang of it, you'll know how it works. So we're looking for a little bit of snapping, so we push that lever in, it should snap back, and it's doing okay. Now let's get the rest of the system all together. We're going to put the main winding gear in place. And we're going to get the lever bracket or clutch lever in, get that spring attached to it so that it winds or clicks itself, or little spring will kind of push it back to its default position, which would be the winding position. Get that little screw cap on there. Again, this is a reverse threaded screw, so we're going to get it started, and then once we get it started, we can just tighten it up. We don't want to tighten too hard. These screws are gentle. You can break them if you're not careful. I'm going to go ahead and put a little oil where the stem sits, and we'll put the stem back in. I'm actually going to take this out one more time. You'll see me remove it as I'm assembling the train. And now we'll start the train assembly from the lowest gear, which is the escapement wheel, and work our way up. So here's the second hand wheel or third wheel, second wheel, and then the main wheel is coming up. It's amazing, once I got these all degreased and cleaned out, the watch was just very smooth. I was very impressed to see that. As abused as this watch was so half a decade ago or half a century ago, it still is in good shape. Replacing the jewels did help the balance function a whole lot better, obviously. I'll get the ratchet stop in place, and then we'll get the ratchet wheel in, and now it's time to set the mainspring barrel. Now that mainspring barrel is keyed on the bottom where the arbor is, and we're just going to gently pull that ratchet stop in, and then you should hear it click when you wind it. And again, we'll put the main gear back in. We'll put the stem back in. And now we can start working on the bridges. In this case, I'm going to start with the barrel bridge. Barrel bridge holds the mainspring barrel and the main wheel, as well as it holds down the stem. And we'll get the two screws in place. This bridge is a whole lot easier to put in than the train bridge, and I'll explain to you why in just a second. We'll get those two screws located on the bridge, and then we'll tighten those down, and then the barrel bridge is in place. Now when I work on the train bridge, this is a relatively delicate procedure. You're going to get the train bridge back over those gears. In this case, we have 3 of them. They're not always going to line up correctly, so you're going to have to fiddle a little bit. And here you can see I grabbed some pointy needle nose pliers, and I'm just going to gently wiggle each gear into position so that its pinion falls into the jewel and seats properly. Now, in almost every occasion when I'm assembling a watch like this, I will usually put one of the bridge screws in place, and I will tighten it down so that it's loose, and not putting any pressure on the gears. And that way I can go ahead and adjust the gears and get it seated correctly. Once I get the bridge screws seated even loosely, then I can play around with the train and get the train to seat correctly. And once the train is seated, when I touch the barrel, the whole gear system should turn. The entire train should rotate. Once that's done, I can tighten down all the screws and make sure that everything is seated correctly. Now, in this case, what I'm going to do is, because I've changed both the hole jewels, what I want to do here is to test the balance. Now, on a very clean watch, what you're going to do is you're going to find that without the escapement or the pallet fork in place, you can go ahead and put the balance in and then just give it a little help with the hand blower, and you can see that articulation in the balance wheel should work very freely. You shouldn't see it slow down at all. It should slow down very, very, very slowly. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and put the screw back in it, and I'm going to look at it from both face up and face down, and I'm going to see if there's any friction on those jewels that we just put in to make sure that the watch is going to work freely. And you can see how the balance is swinging perfectly, and it's not slowing down at all. So we'll look at it from the face up position, and you can see it's not slowing down. That's good. It's working really well, so I'm pretty happy with those jewels. Now we can move on to the next step. So once you're completely happy with the lack of friction on the balance, we can move on to assembly of the pallet fork and get that all in place. And to do that, we have to remove the balance bridge one more time. So I'm going to unscrew it, put it aside in the parts tray, and we'll come back to this in just a few minutes. Again, be very careful with the balance because you can damage that hairspring relatively easy. I'm going to give this a little wind and just make sure that the mainspring is pushing all the gears and supplying power to the train. That looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and give it a little oil before we go ahead with the next part of the assembly. Don't over oil a watch. You're just going to put a little bit of oil on your oil stick. Just get it in there. If you get a little bit too much excessive oil, just go ahead with the hand blower and blow it out, or use some watch paper to kind of pick it up. Now I'm going to listen to the movement. I should hear very little friction on any of the jewels, and if that's the case, we know we're in good shape. We can move on to the pallet fork. Every time I assemble a watch and do this on YouTube, guys, I always tell you the pallet fork is very, very delicate, so be careful. Again, I do the same thing I do with the bridge. I will put the pallet bridge in place. I will put that screw in. I won't tighten it all the way. I'll just get it started so that I know I can freely move the pallet back and forth to make sure that I'm seated correctly in the upper and lower jewels for the pallet. Once I know that's good, I can tighten up that screw. And we can move on to the next step, which is to gently wind the watch a little bit. And then we're going to test the pallet and make sure the escapement and the movement, the train, is actually moving forward. And you can see the pallet does articulate perfectly with the escapement, and it is pushing the pallet back and forth. So once we get the balance back in, it should take off. And this is my favorite part. If everything goes as good as I always hope, just give that a little twist and the watch should take right off, just like it did here. Now that that's done, I can go ahead and tighten the balance bridge down. Okay, so that's done. The watch is running. Now we can go ahead and assemble the upper side of the watch, which would include the remaining set gears, the cannon pinion, and hour wheel. I'm just going to give this a little bit more of a wind just to keep it running. And for all of those people who always think that I don't time a watch, well, I just don't show it. Timing a watch can take up to 20 minutes or longer. Sometimes I can spend close to a couple of hours timing a watch. But I do want to show you here the results of the face down position. And you can see here Not bad for over 100 years old. It's running plus or minus 4 seconds. And I did go ahead and play with the beat error a little bit, but I didn't really over adjust it. I just really wanted to time this watch and get it as close as possible. Now we've got it in the face up position. And again, I'm just going to let this run. It's been running for a few minutes here, and I'm going to take a look at what's going on, plus or minus 10 seconds, but this is going to balance out. And again, for a watch that's over 100 years old, yeah, I think this is pretty good. So yes, I do time my watches. I just don't always film it. Okay, so let's move on to the upper section of the watch. We're gonna actually put a little oil on the set gear pinion, that little post that holds that set wheel. We got the cannon pinion put back in place. We'll get that set gear installed, and now the hour wheel. And before I move on to anything else, I'm also going to make sure that I've loosened up the screws on the dial feet, and we're going to install a brand new dial washer. Dial washers will typically last about 30 years under average use that a watch like this would get today. So we'll loosen up those 3 dial feet screws, and we'll get the dial set up and installed on the watch. Once the dial's on and I'm happy with its position, we can go ahead and tighten up those 3 screws. Okay, so far so good. Let's move on to the next step, which is to case the watch. In this case, I'm going to get it into the case frame. So we're gently going to line it up. Once it's lined up and installed in the frame, we can go ahead and put the case screws back into the watch movement. Those 2 screws, again, those are half cut, and we'll tighten up the movement onto the case or frame of the case. Typically, almost every watch has 2 case screws, even in today's world with newer watches, but sometimes you'll see more. Now I've gone ahead and polished the case also. You can see it's much more cleaner. And I've got the back on, and we can start working on the hands. First thing we install is the hour hand. Once I get the hour hand on, I'm going to go ahead and pull that lever out and then set it. I like to set it at 3 or 9 o'clock just so that I make sure the hands are going to be perpendicular when I install the minute hand. I will go ahead and install that minute hand. And it just pushes onto the cannon pinion. Then I'm going to go ahead and just adjust the height of it just to make sure that it floats above the dial. That will make sure that we don't actually cause any interference with the hour hand. And we'll get that brand new second hand. This is a genuine Elgin hand for this particular watch. So we'll go ahead and get that seated in correctly. Don't want to push those in too tight because you don't want those rubbing against the dial. If the second hand is rubbing against the dial, it's also going to interfere with the timing. So keep that in mind. And now we've got the new glass in the front bezel, and we'll go ahead and screw that onto the watch. And we're pretty much done with this. The watch is timed, polished, rebuilt, and serviced. So on this watch, we obviously replaced the crystal. We put in a new second hand, upper and lower hole jewels on the balance, and a complete service with a new mainspring. There you go. Guys, I hope you liked this video. If you did like this video, please give this a thumbs up. And if you know anybody who's interested in this, go ahead and hit share and go ahead and share this on social media. And if you are not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to my channel if you want to see more videos like this, as I post them once a week, usually, sometimes twice a week. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.